Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 30 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Carolina Hurricanes and won by a score of 4-1. The last couple of games that the Sharks have played have been against extremely difficult opponents. A few nights ago, it was Washington, the top team in the Eastern Conference, and a couple of nights ago, it was Dallas, the second best team in the Western Conference, and it did not get any easier with today's matchup as they go up against the Carolina Hurricanes, the second best team in the Eastern Conference. In fact, all three of these teams top 4 in the entire NHL. And that was reflected in the scores and the way that the Sharks performed in those last two games. They got smacked around by the Capitals, and then while it was closer on the scoreboard against the Dallas Stars, it was a game in which the Sharks never really had much of a foothold in. And so perhaps it was expected that a similar thing would play out here today in this matchup against the Hurricanes, especially when you also consider the fact that unlike Washington and Dallas, the Sharks and the Hurricanes have already played once this season. That was Game 3 of the entire year, and it was a men versus boys type of situation. The Sharks got completely outplayed, a very unceremonious loss there in the third game of the season, and Carolina just really took it to them. And now, with Carolina being the home team here tonight, it was very, very possible that the same thing would play out. And so you have to give tremendous credit to the San Jose Sharks, not only for this victory, but the fact that this was actually one of the more complete games that they have played all season long, especially when you consider the strength of their opponent. Now, it might not appear that way. Yes, the Sharks do get the victory here, but they do get outshot, and if you actually look at shot attempts, they get heavily beat in that area as well. But it is very important to remember that the Carolina Hurricanes are a rather unique team with their heavy volume shooting type of approach. If you actually look at like the first 40 minutes of this game, yes, the Sharks, they do get outshot. Yes, the Sharks do get out attempted, but can you really think of more than maybe a small handful of really dangerous chances that the Hurricanes had in those first couple of periods? Not really. The couple of goals that the Sharks scored were better than anything Carolina was actually able to generate, and so this was an extremely efficient first 40 minutes of the game here tonight for San Jose, and that's why you have to be very, very impressed. On top of that, the Hurricanes, they're not the most skilled team in the entire league. They don't have the extremely high-end talent of many other teams, or at least some of the other top teams in the entire NHL, but they are extremely hardworking, which actually makes this a very interesting measuring stick type of game. Could the Sharks actually outcompete? Could they actually stick with the Hurricanes throughout the night? They were unable to do that in their first matchup, but they did manage to accomplish that in this one. So it starts out in the first period, and within just the first 30 seconds of this game, the Sharks get on the board. That is a goal from Colin Graf. He has been the Sharks' best forward in each of their last couple of outings, and while he may not have been the best tonight, he was certainly up there, and this goal is his first as a part of this new put-together Sharks first line, which I'll get to a little bit later, but that gives the Sharks the 1-0 lead. However, the Hurricanes, while they didn't get a lot of great chances 5-on-5, they do manage to strike on their power play. That ties the game up at 1 heading into the second period. And for the first couple of minutes of this second period, the Hurricanes seem to be getting back to their style of game and their style of play. All of the first few minutes of the second period are played pretty much within the San Jose Sharks defensive zone. But San Jose responds very well after that, and they come back with a couple of goals here to take this to a 3-1 lead. Now, the first one comes from John Klingberg, which is notable because John Klingberg actually gets on the score sheet. That does not happen every day. But what I really liked about this goal in comparison to the other goals of this game is that it comes off of strong work in the offensive zone, which is not something that we have actually seen a lot from the Sharks this season. For instance, if you just look at the first goal from Colin Graf, what does this come off of? Well, it is the fact that the Hurricanes turn the puck over. Will Smith gets it at the blue line. He feeds it to Celebrini, who makes an incredible individual play, gets this to Colin Graf heading to the net for that tap-in goal. It's a very nice goal. I'm not going to complain about it, but it is, again, that type of quick strike offense off of an unforced error by the Hurricanes. But what I really like about the Klingberg goal is it's San Jose. They're working hard in the offensive zone. They're cycling the puck. They're just doing a lot of the small things correctly, a lot of the details of their game. Kurashev had probably like one of his best shifts of the entire season, especially as of late over the last few weeks. Celebrini was on point. Both those players pick up assists, and then Klingberg, smart move, reads the play, comes into the slot for this goal. That makes it 2-1. And then it is Alex Wenberg on the power play. That makes it 3-1. In the third period, things start to get, a little bit away from the San Jose Sharks, the Hurricanes as the home team trying to respond down a couple of goals, and so it looks a little bit uglier to end this one off. However, the Sharks, they managed to hold on. Nedeljkovic was very solid against his former team, and it ends up with a Macklin Celebrini empty netter to put this one away, the 4-1 victory. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line, Celebrini, Smith with Colin Graf. And so I'll start off with him. This was a trio of players that we have been waiting, honestly, weeks to be put together. The Sharks have trialed Tyler Toffoli for many, many games. That doesn't really work out. Kurashev got a good handful of chances as well. Even Eklund got a couple of games. Probably not enough to really see if it works, but still a couple of games. But finally, the Sharks decide to go with Graf. As I mentioned, he has been the best forward on the team in each of these last couple of games, so certainly deserving of this role. I imagine the hesitancy from Ryan Warsofsky to put these three players together doesn't come from anything Colin Graf has done poorly, but more so just due to the logistics of the situation. The problem here being that Colin Graf is the San Jose Sharks' top penalty killer, and the thing is that Ryan Warsofsky loves to get Celebrini and Smith on the ice as an opposing penalty or as an opposing power play expires, so that they can try to take advantage of the other team having to toss on their third and fourth liners who didn't play the last 2 minutes on the ice. And so if Colin Graf has to have, a minute and a half of penalty killing time on a particular power play, he's not going to be able to join his two line mates in that type of situation. On top of that, in certain games where the Sharks end up getting called for 4, 5, 6 minor penalties, and so there's a ton of shorthanded time, and Colin Graf is playing 4, 5, 6 minutes of that, well, then matching the 15, 16, 17 even strength minutes that Celebrini and Smith may end up getting will be extremely difficult. And so it is tough logistically to make this work, but when they do get on the ice 5-on-5 together, it had very good results here tonight. This was probably one of the best games we have seen a first line at all for the San Jose Sharks play this entire season. They got some good offensive shifts against an extremely well-oiled machine in the Carolina Hurricanes. Let's point out that this is not happening against the Chicago Blackhawks or the Vancouver Canucks. This is happening against a very strong defensive team, and these three players were able to come together very, very well. Colin Graf, he scores this goal. This comes off of great speed to recognize that this play is going the other way. Probably something that Tyler Toffoli would not have been able to pull off, but Graf has the legs to actually be able to beat his man to the net and to get this tap in goal. Colin Graf also did some very good work on the John Klingberg goal, had a couple of other really bright spot moments. There was one where he actually carries the puck straight from the defensive zone into the offensive zone to create a good chance, getting around a couple of Hurricanes defenders. That was quite nice to see. And then as things just move forward, hopefully this first line remains together, we'll even see further chemistry actually develop. There were a couple of times here where Colin Graf had a slightly better play to make, but he goes for the simple option of just dumping the puck in. Eventually, as time passes, he'll learn that he can play off a little bit more his two line mates, and so this first line, extreme promise shown here tonight. When it comes to Macklin Celebrini, he had a rough couple of games. In fact, his two roughest games probably of the entire year. He was not good against Washington, he was not good against Dallas, and it was the first time all year in which he went back-to-back games without picking up a single point. But Celebrini, he returns here tonight in full force. Unlike, Colin Graf, I mentioned he was right up there at the top of best forwards of the night. The reason he was not the best is because Celebrini exists. He was by far the Sharks' best player this game. Not only does he pick up the primary assist off of a great play to Colin Graf, not only does he get the primary assist on a nice pass to John Klingberg, not only does he also have his hands all over the power play goal, despite the fact that he doesn't pick up a point here. But what I really, really liked from Celebrini was actually just this empty netter, because this is showcasing the value that he not only brings offensively, but that he also brings defensively. We know that Celebrini is one of, if not the best player in the entire NHL when it comes to winning puck battles along the boards, and that is exactly what he does in this situation. He comes at this Hurricanes player who has his back turned, he gets the stick check, he steals this puck extremely cleanly, he gets this pass through Shane Gostisbehere at the blue line, who has been under the radar, one of the most effective defenseman thus far this season for Carolina, and he gets this one to Wennberg, and then not only that, wins the race down the ice to get this empty net goal. That wasn't 100% necessary because Wennberg gets taken down and they would have just given the goal for free because it was with an empty net, but still it was entirely 200 feet complete play from Celebrini to cap off his 3-point night here. And so despite the last couple of rough games, Celebrini, the superstar that he is, it was only a matter of time before he turns it around, and it did not take very long. The final player on this line was Will Smith, who I thought had a slightly more muted game than his two line mates. He was not as bright as Celebrini, and he was not as effective as Colin Graf, so technically you could say he was the third wheel, but he still had some good moments. The turnover there at the blue line that led to the Colin Graf goal was quite nice, and I like the fact that the Sharks are using him a little bit higher up in the offensive zone, allows Celebrini and Colin Graf to do a bit more of the dirty work deeper in there and along the boards, so that Will Smith can try to use his hockey IQ to read the play from up high and see if he can come in for a clutch takeaway or a clutch one-timer or something along those lines. So that was nice to see. And so Smith was a generally pretty solid player here in this game. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, here we have Eklund with Wenberg and Tyler Toffoli. So Toffoli does get bumped off of that first line, but he ends up taking the spot of Kurashev on this second line, joining those two. And if you recall in my previous review, I had mentioned that the second line didn't really do anything offensively, even if they were rather solid within their own end. And I had mentioned that that might be viewed as a positive in a game in which Celebrini was popping off with 3 points. And that's exactly what ends up happening here tonight. Once again, Eklund, Wenberg, and Toffoli do very, very little offensively. They had one very close call late in the third period, a nice little passing play between Eklund and Toffoli that almost put this game away 4-1 with like 3 or 4 minutes to go. But besides that, it basically did absolutely nothing from an offensive perspective. But they were relatively solid defensively. I thought Wenberg had a generally decent game. I thought Eklund had a generally decent game. And Toffoli was there, I guess you could say, is probably the nicest way to put it. But at the same time, like I said in that game with the Dallas Stars, this is a situation where they are able to skate by because Celebrini, Colin Graf, and Will Smith were that good, but on nights where those three players aren't going to be able to lead the way so significantly. So the second line needs to step up. They absolutely didn't do that here tonight, despite the fact that, at least to their credit, Wenberg gets the power play goal assisted by William Eklund. So the Sharks still need more from these three players. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, this is where we have Kurashev joining Dellandrea and Jeff Skinner. Starting off with Skinner, this was a very similar game to the one he played against the Dallas Stars. He was not an extremely noticeable player, Jeff Skinner was, but he did manage to come in with like 2 really high danger chances, actually came extremely close to scoring a goal against his former team, Carolina, and so he continues to be that type of silent but deadly type of player, I guess you could say, very similar to, and I've compared him multiple times to this player, very similar to Tyler Toffoli of last season, not so much this year. When it comes to Ty Dellandrea, he had a very, very good chance to actually score a goal in this game. Got robbed by Kochetkov on this nice passing play for himself. Generally, I thought Dellandrea was actually rather solid in this game. Not necessarily doing a ton, but very just sturdy in his own end would be the nicest way to put it there. Just solid defensive game, offensive. When he was able to strike, he came out pretty big. And then when it comes to Philip Kurashev, like I mentioned on that John Klingberg goal, it was one of the best shifts that we have seen in the offensive zone from Philip Kurashev all season long. He's been a relatively quiet player for these last couple of weeks, which has not been great for someone who has had decent time on the second line, even at times on the first line for the San Jose Sharks. But it was nice to see him manage to contribute here with that point. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, the biggest thing to be said about these three players is that they actually ended up getting a good amount of ice time, which is in stark contrast to the last game where they basically barely played. Ostapchuk managing to have 11 minutes in this game. And Ostapchuk, he was a player who, when the Sharks originally called him up a couple of weeks ago, I did enjoy his performances. He brought a good amount of speed to this fourth line, but it's also a situation of what have you done for me lately? And while Ostapchuk was not bad in this game, we are kind of trending more so towards what we were seeing from Ostapchuk near the end of last season when the Sharks originally acquired him in that Fabian Zetterlund trade, which is a performance where you don't really actually see much of him. He doesn't actually make a huge impact. I think he had like one decently close call at the net, but that was pretty much it. And so again, not a bad game from Ostapchuk, but not making huge impact on it either. Now you could say, well, for a fourth line center, that's not bad, and that is absolutely the case. However, Ostapchuk obviously has, I guess, hopes, and the Sharks, I imagine, have hopes of being slightly higher in the lineup, but games in which you don't really make much of an impact, even if you're not particularly negative, don't really bode well for your chances of playing higher up into a top 9 position, and basically kind of lock you in more so to a fourth line role. When it comes to his two line mates, Adam Gaudette, Barclay Goodrow, they had some decent moments here tonight, but while the fourth line did get a good amount of ice time, it's not as though they actually ended up making that much of an impact here tonight, just relatively solid within their own end, and that was about it. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, the big thing to note here tonight is that Shakir Mukhamadullin ends up missing a third straight game. And so if you miss one, that's not, I mean, it's a relatively big deal. I don't want Shakir Mukhamadullin to be missing one game even, but it's not necessarily the end of the world. When you miss 2 games, that's a pretty big deal. But when you miss 3 straight games, like, that's a clear message being sent by Ryan Warsofsky. And indeed, he talked about that he wants Mukhamadullin to get kind of a full reset here. So it's an interesting approach. We'll see if it works out for him. I'm not particularly happy because I don't want to continue having to watch Nick Leddy in the lineup. And with the fact that the Sharks actually win here tonight, in fact, their first victory with both John Klingberg and Nick Leddy in the lineup this season, now a beautiful record of 1-4-2, it is very possible that the Sharks won't actually change the lineup heading into the next game, which could leave Mukhamadullin on the outside looking in for a 4th straight game. And at this point, you are getting a little bit nervous. It's important to remember that Mukhamadullin is on a 1-year, $1 million contract, a type of a prove-it sort of deal, similar in a way to what we saw the Sharks give Thomas Bordeleau and Danil Gushchin at the beginning of last season. And as we know, neither of those 2 players are within the San Jose Sharks organization anymore. Now, that wasn't a huge problem because the Sharks have tremendous forward depth. You look forward at what the Sharks' top 6 could look like in 2 to 3 years. Eklund, Celebrini, Smith, Misa, Chernyshov, Musty. You don't really need Thomas Bordeleau and Danil Gushchin in that top 6 or even in the top 9 when you also consider players like Bistedt and Lund and Haltinen and all of these different guys. But on the blue line, the Sharks are significantly less deep. They don't have that many players. Sam Dickinson leads the way. Cagnoni and Polkamp are interesting defensive prospects. And then they have like Leo Selin-Wallenius and Havelid kind of on the outskirts there. But then a lot of just lottery tickets that don't necessarily have a super high chance of making it in the NHL. And so Mukhamadullin was actually a very important piece, or is, I should say, a very important piece of this roster. And having him go into a situation where he doesn't necessarily play and he's not necessarily happy, well, does he request a trade at the end of this season? Does he decide to walk and go back to the KHL? If those things happen, the Sharks will be in a much worse spot for it because they don't have a lot of players to actually take his spot. So hopefully that's kind of an overreaction there, and he gets back into the lineup very, very soon, and he actually manages to hold down a spot. But judging by the first 30 games of this season, I'm not entirely sure if that's going to end up happening. When it comes to the defensemen who actually did play here tonight, it was a very effective game for many of them across the board. Both Dmitry Orlov and Timothy Liljegren looked quite solid. Orlov, revenge game, you could sort of say. That happened back in Game 3 of the season because, of course, his former team is Carolina, and he was not very happy with where that ended up with. But obviously, the Sharks ended up losing that first game, and so this was a do-over of that revenge game. And I thought Orlov played pretty well defensively, didn't do much offensively, but pretty well defensively. His defensive partner, Timothy Liljegren, one of the better games he has played in the last couple of weeks. Not a difficult thing to accomplish because Liljegren has been quite bad in many of these last few games. And there were still a couple of errors from Liljegren that did exist here tonight, but mostly rather solid defensively. When it comes to the Sharks' second pairing, this, of course, is where we have John Klingberg, who has been probably the most hated player on the San Jose Sharks thus far this season. And I'm not saying that that's an incorrect opinion to have, because Klingberg has been a bit of a mess throughout much of this season. And you know, on top of that, he has been playing a ton of minutes when he's actually been in the lineup, which is not really a good mesh. But credit where credit is due. John Klingberg did play well here tonight, and honestly, you could probably say was his best game of the season. That's not a particularly difficult bar to clear because mostly Klingberg has been rather bad throughout this year, but still, he was one of, if not the best defenseman for the San Jose Sharks in this game because he actually carried forward some of what he had started in the last one against the Dallas Stars. I had mentioned in that game against Dallas that he was pretty good within his own end, but he was contributing nothing offensively, and that could not remain the same. But here tonight, he was still pretty good within his own end. A couple of errors. I didn't like how he handled certain rush chances from Carolina. His gap control is still kind of bad, leaves a lot of space available for the opposing team's players, but he was still pretty good within his own end, even despite that. And offensively, he was also able to contribute. He picks up the secondary assist on a nice little pass, nothing major, but a nice little pass there to William Eklund in the slot. But I really liked his goal, the instincts to come down for that slot chance. Not necessarily a lot of defensemen on this team would have made a play like that, but Klingberg, he comes through. Very, very nice shot as well from him. And so he manages to increase his point total from 7 to 9 here tonight. And Klingberg, again, just an all-around pretty solid outing. This does not necessarily change the context around Klingberg on this team, right? We're 21 games into the season now for him, and the first 20, most of them were rather negative, and so one singular game doesn't necessarily dig you out of that hole, but maybe for Rosovsky it kind of does, and so we'll see what happens moving forward. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, also a nice bounce-back game for him. He was very bad against the Washington Capitals, probably his worst game of the entire season, and then he was only slightly better the other night against the Dallas Stars, but he again sees a step forward here tonight against the Hurricanes, where I thought he was mostly pretty good. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing here, we have Nick Leddy with Dickinson. As I mentioned earlier on, I don't want to keep seeing Nick Leddy in the lineup. I don't think Leddy was like a huge liability or anything like that. He had one really bad play early on in this game in the first period where he gets stripped of the puck, and it leads to a really great opportunity, or what could have been a really great opportunity, I should say, for the Hurricanes. But besides that, he was mostly decent. But, you know, a player who is just being mostly decent in like 1 out of 11 games that they have played, it's not necessarily like a big thing. And so if there was one player to be taken out of the lineup for Shakir Mukhamadullin, it is obviously Nick Leddy at this point. But as I said, the Sharks might go with the same defensive core as they had here tonight because of how well things went for the next game. When it comes to Sam Dickinson, this was a very important outing, I felt, for Dickinson, and I was really hopeful that he would be in the lineup, and I'm very happy that he was, because if we go back to that game against the Carolina Hurricanes, this was Dickinson's second career game, and it was a massive, massive wake-up call for him, because the first matchup was against the Anaheim Ducks, and the Ducks are a strong offensive team, no doubt about it, but it wasn't a massive challenge for him. But game 2 against the Carolina Hurricanes, that truly showed that you had arrived in the NHL, because Dickinson had never faced off against a team like Carolina when he was playing in the OHL, and that was one of Dickinson's worst. At the time, it was his worst game of the season. Perhaps it even still remains his worst game of the season. He was really bad against the Hurricanes, but we saw tonight, game 30 of the year, game 23, I believe, of Dickinson's season, the tremendous amount of progress he has made since then. There were still a couple of errors here tonight by Dickinson, but I thought generally he played a pretty solid defensive game, significantly better than what he was in the team's first matchup against Carolina, and so it has been very enjoyable to see the progress that he has made. And tonight he ends up with about 17 and a half minutes. This is actually a new career high for him on the year. Yes, it's a situation where he did get that final like minute or so of the entire game, and so that slightly inflated his ice time above where it was previously, but still, it's a situation where Ryan Rosovsky is beginning to show a little bit more trust in Dickinson. Dickinson is beginning to actually show that he is worthy of that trust, and so hopefully this can continue on the trendward upwards, and that the Sharks don't pull the rug out from under him at this point, because as I said, he has made a lot of smart progress, good progress defensively this season, and eventually that's going to lead to more offensive opportunities. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender Nedeljkovic. He gets into action here tonight against his former team. He had actually been the goaltender between the pipes in the first matchup of the season between these two teams, and he was not good in that one. He made a couple of pretty crucial errors that were just very ugly, I would say, in that game. And so he, like with the San Jose Sharks, had a rough outing in that one. However, he redeemed himself fully in this game. He didn't have to make a ton of great saves within the first 40 minutes here tonight, right? The one goal he let in was about the one goal that you'd probably expect for him to let in. But in the third period, that's truly where he was challenged. He did have to come up with like 2 or 3, maybe even 4 pretty big saves, and he was up for the challenge each and every time. And so Nedeljkovic, who honestly in his last few starts has been kind of unremarkable, not bad, but just generally rather average. Nice to see him actually have a good outing here and help the Sharks pick up this victory. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday. They'll be taking on the Philadelphia Flyers, who have been a surprise thus far this season. They finished 4th last in the league in this past year, which was obviously not very good, but they have been much, much better this season, led by the newly acquired Trevor Zegras on their team. And so this is not a walk in the park type of game. I mean, realistically, no game for the San Jose Sharks this season is going to be a walk in the park, but this is still a rather tough opponent, maybe not as tough as they have faced, but still have to be able to bring your A game for the chance to win. Class dismissed.